All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. You are in the Organizing the Green New Deal course, number 1, Racial Justice and the Just Transition. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very excited to have you. We've got, I think, a good syllabus and lineup of speakers over the next several months here. And before we get into the content for today, we'll just do some introductions, get you all a little bit oriented here, and then we'll pass it off to Femi to take us off from there. So my name is Nick Caleb. I'm the climate energy attorney at Breach Collective, and I'll tell you a little bit more about us in a few minutes. We wanted to put on this programming basically because there's this political space open right now with a lot of people talking about, big terms like Green New Deal and just transition. And a lot of those concepts are still kind of floating signifiers. They're ideas that are waiting to find political expression. And there's quite a bit of debate about what the functional content of those ideas are going to turn into when they get expressed politically. We as in Breach and in the Power Shift Network, want to approach any kind of Green New Deal or just transition, promoting principles of racial, gender, worker, international, and intergenerational justice. And we have selected speakers for this course that we hope to bring those ideas out for you. Some of the speakers will talk about big ideas, a little bit more abstract. Some of the folks will be lawyers. Some of the people will be activists talking about campaigns that are being waged. And we hope that it's a good mix for folks and it's interesting. Just one note about programming. We've done this kind of education in the past, or I have it at separate nonprofits, and always been much smaller and intimate. This is going to be much larger, and so it's going to be more of a webinar type experience. And we hope that you'll make use of the chat. There are functions for answering questions. If there's some time at the end, we'll take questions. And we're open to figuring out some kind of sort of like outside of Zoom sharing capacity if people are really interested in that. So just kind of let us know. Okay, before we go any further, I'm going to pass the mic to Danny Sigwalt from PowerShift Network to tell you a little bit about PowerShift.
Hey y'all. Like Nick said, my name is Danny. I use she, her pronouns, and I am co-executive director of PowerShift Network, which is a network of 98 different member organizations, all committed to throwing down for the youth climate movement. So some of you might be familiar with the PowerShift convergences that played a super big role in building out the youth climate movement of the late 2000s. And early 10s of this millennium. And we are so much more than that at this point in time. We exist to really support movement infrastructure for young folks and for folks committed to halting the climate crisis. So we were really excited when Breach reached out to us and asked for support on the tech side with bringing this group together. We do things like share access to our Zoom resources, because the fact of the matter is, as a network, we're more effectively set up to share resources that help us build power with fewer dollars and fewer resources, which is what we're really aiming to do as a network, in addition to building connections across movement areas, deepening collective praxis in terms of understanding what climate justice really means, and deepening young folks and older folks' understanding of the systems that have brought us to the reality of the climate crisis as we see it today, and being better equipped to dismantle all of those systems together, which felt super in alignment with the way that Breach was framing out this course. And we were super excited to be able to partner with them in bringing this space together. I'm really excited about all of the really incredible speakers that they have lined up, and I'm excited to be able to amplify and support Breach Collective's work. That's all I got. Back to you, Nick.
Did you want to promote the PowerShift Convergence stuff coming
Oh,
up?
I absolutely do. All of my work right now feels like it's around the convergence, but we have a convergence planned. We've really intentionally relaunched our convergence to be bigger and better than ever in a lot of ways, with fewer people but more impact. We're really focused on bringing in young folks from across the country to come to a convergence to learn more about what activism looks like, deepen our collective praxis through movement history, and also deepening our political analysis and taking action to halt the climate crisis and call attention to the many ways that our government officials are failing us and corporations are being supported over people's needs through our government. It's going to be taking place virtually April 16th to 25th. They're going to be really incredible speakers that we're really excited about. Lots of really brilliant young folks coming to speak up and share their story and build community, as well as hard skills trainings around things like digital security and nonviolent direct action and facilitation. Just lots of really critical skills that folks need to be able to build power and community. Thanks, Dick.
Awesome, thanks, Danny. And yeah, Breach is brand new. We just launched in December. Employees from different climate justice nonprofits, and PowerShift has been amazing to us in helping us get up and running. So if you're, youth activists or somebody who's in the nonprofit world and you're looking to support and getting networked, I think this is a great organization to touch base with. So I'll tell you a little bit about Breach. You've got me and Sherry Jackson from Breach here today, and we'll be serving kind of the moderator role. We are a new 501c3 nonprofit. We just started in December, and we partner with communities on the front lines of the climate crisis to advance justice through locally driven campaigns rooted in the power of grassroots organizing, legal advocacy, and human stories. We are a unionized shop with the Communication Workers of America. All of us have been through labor struggles at other nonprofits, and we are very, very happy to help and support you. If you're a nonprofit worker looking to unionize your workplace, please reach out to us. I'm not going to talk a ton about Breach tonight because we're going to showcase some of our work in classes to come. But next week, 3 folks from Breach are going to talk about sort of international angles and what's happening geopolitically and through international institutions right now. This course is offered free of charge, and you're not expected to make any sorts of contributions. We're going to post the content for free online afterward and share it through networks. If you are really inspired by what you see and you want to support it, you're of course welcome to make a donation, and Sherry's going to post a link in the chat. And if you want to make a gift specifically for this type of programming, you can make that known in a donation. We would love to provide space for top quality speakers like Femi and others to be able to speak to movement actors, so that we're sharing the best and most exciting ideas and making sure that we're building institutions together as we win our battles. So I'm going to introduce Femi now. So Olufemi Taiwo is our speaker for tonight. He is a prolific and exciting thinker, in my opinion, and I don't think I'm the only one. He's written a ton about racial and climate justice and all sorts of other topics. He's currently a professor at philosophy at Georgetown University, received his PhD from UCLA several years back. I'm not going to spend too much more time introducing him, other than to say, I mean, we are so excited to have you with us today, Femi, and looking forward to what you have to tell us. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here, and looking forward to talking about a broad perspective on the Green New Deal type political issues and the problems brought up by different kinds of political approaches to environmental justice and climate justice. And so I thought I would just give a really broad kind of overview about how I think of the politics here, which will kind of lay all of my political cards on the table, right? Every kind of part of this view is contentious, and I think there's a lot to be gained from thinking through the different levels of analysis here. So some of the stuff I have to say is like pretty conceptual. Some of the stuff I have to say is pretty campaign level. So I hope there's something of interest for people from different varieties of background and different places where people engage with these issues. So I'm starting with this graph, this figure from a piece that came out in Nature early in the pandemic. And the researchers were trying to make the point that the COVID-19 pandemic and the climate crisis were kind of compound crises. And what they meant by that was that all of these climate-related kind of hazards, as they put it, that are going to happen over the next year. It's been, I believe, something like half a year since this article came out. So, we're still in the world being described by this graph. All these political crises are difficult to separate from the climate crisis, that our ability to respond to these and our ability to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're going to be increasingly kind of co-constituted, come together. And in a way, there's a kind of obvious point that they're making, which is just that if COVID-19 is happening at the same time as these crises, it's going to be harder to fight two problems than one problem, whether we're talking about the west of the United States, the south of Brazil, or northwest India. But one of the points that they were making was a little less obvious, which is just that institutionally speaking, our ability to respond to crisis at all, and what kinds of responses, I think more importantly, what kinds of responses are queued up, have to do with institutional capacity and the potential fact that whether it's wildfires or whether it's floods, could actually exceed the ability of states, multinational institutions, NGOs to do anything at all. And that kind of more deeply political institutional way of thinking about these crises, rather than thinking about the damage that water is going to do in flooding or that fire is going to do in wildfires, but the damage that institutional lack of capacity is going to do, that's more in keeping with how I think about climate crisis in general. It's a problem for institutions, of institutions, by institutions. At the end of the day, the rain, the water, the sea level, they're going to do what they're going to do. But the outcomes that we're interested in, what happens to people on a broad scale and on a large scale, is going to be defined by these facts about what our institutions are up to. That's the broad perspective I'm taking on the political dimensions of this crisis. This is a quote that just says what I just finished saying, right? Movements and developments in the natural world will be asking the questions about how we're going to meet our basic needs, but our fate will be determined by our collective political answers. And that's just saying the political stakes of some of the things that I'm trying to think of. The thing that might be surprising about this slide, or the thing that's maybe a little different from the norm, is the description of the compound crisis of COVID-19 and climate and whatever else is happening as a crisis of racial capitalism. One, because these are crises that are more often termed and described in ecological terms, what the environment is doing, but also because the specific political way that I'm understanding them is a non-standard one, racial capitalism. So the first part of what I'm going to talk about is this framework, this way of looking at the world, which is different, non-standard in a lot of ways, but I think is a useful one. So racial capitalism, what's that? It was popularized by Cedric Robinson. He's not the first person to use the term. The term proliferated in radical schools of thought in East Africa and Southern Africa, especially South Africa, where they were using racial capitalism as a way to talk about how apartheid was structured in South Africa. What's different about the way that Cedric Robinson talked about racial capitalism is he was talking about planet-sized politics, right? World systems theory, as some people ended up calling this kind of way of thinking about politics. And that's a good match for capitalism, which is an economic system that is also planet-sized. And the basic perspective of racial capitalism as he developed it, I think, is usefully thought of in this way. So racial capitalism is three things. It's a mode of production. So how do we produce stuff, right? And that's the kind of thing that capitalism by itself maybe is a good explanation of. But it's also, two, a form of social organization. So it's not just how we produce stuff, but how the society that produces that stuff organizes itself in fully general senses. And it's also, very importantly, the proliferator of ideologies. How do we justify the stuff that we do? In particular, he uses the term racialism to describe the kind of thinking that was proliferated by this historical trend, racial capitalism. So to use an example that might be familiar to those of us who were educated in the United States or know a bit about the United States, we could think about the US South and the economic system there. In what sense was it racial capitalism? Well, it was capitalist in the sense that it was a system of production designed around production of commodities for exchange, in particular cotton being a very important one. There was a whole system of social organization built around how cotton was produced. That was racial slavery. It wasn't just a system of labor, though it was very importantly that, right? Being enslaved meant a position on the labor hierarchy, but it also meant what rights you had. It also meant who you could marry. It also meant what contracts you could enter into. It meant what kind of disrespect you might face, what codes of etiquette asked of you. And how is all of that justified? By the ideology of white supremacy, right? So racial capitalism just tells a kind of conjoined story about these three things, which we might think of separately, but which on the racial capitalism way of thinking, we don't. So that's racial capitalism. What's racism? I think a really good explanation of racism on this view, and that's helpful for thinking through the particular complications of climate crisis, is provided by Ruthie Gilmore, one of the foremost theorists of racial capitalism. And she defines racism as the state-sanctioned and/or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. It's a mouthful, lots of stuff happening there, right? But we can just split it up into parts. State-sanctioned and/or extra-legal. So it might be the state or country, might be private things like corporations. Production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability. Right, so there are group level differences in vulnerability. That fact that there are group differences is produced and it's exploited, right? So the fact that there is a system of racial slavery helps explain why Black people and white people had different vulnerability in the US South, for example. And vulnerability to what? She says premature death. I myself like the phrase material security. The securities we have with respect to things without which we cannot continue living: food security, water security, energy security, security from interpersonal violence, those kinds of core needs that we have. But those differences in vulnerability are produced, they're exploited, and they're exploited by people that are working with the state and the formal apparatus, but they're also exploited by other people. Okay, so that's the basic view. I would just add to this that we could, following Gilmore, view racial justice in a really general sense as about distributions of this kind, right? So in Gilmore's definition, it's about how vulnerability to premature death is distributed. We could think about that in really literal terms. How is housing security distributed? How's energy security distributed? How's environmental security distributed? Political power, resources, money, how are those distributed? I think, there's a broad and powerful perspective if we look at these things in distributive terms. And I'm happy to talk about later about why I think this is clarifying. But for now, I'm just offering this up as my perspective, and we can talk about it and focus and challenge it, whatever it is. But that's the view. That's the kind of framework that I'm operating with. What does it have to do with crisis, especially environmental crises, the kinds that we're thinking about here? And it's really helpful to think of the example of famines, which is, to put it in terms of the security language, we were just thinking extreme food insecurity, right? And the reason why I find this political approach so powerful, I think, is really well demonstrated by the case of famines. For years and years, economists, social scientists, thinkers have tried to explain why it is that famines happen. And prominent, famous ones have tried to explain this in terms of the availability of food. You might recognize the name Malthus under there. That's a person who, there are neo-Malthusian ways of thinking about climate crisis, where people just think, well, the problem is there's too many people, right? For the amount of food that we have, for the amount of energy that we have, for the amount of ecological resources that are available. And that's the core problem with our environmental politics right now. But there's another way of thinking about the core problem, and that was suggested by the Indian economist and philosopher Amartya Sen. He titled this the entitlement approach. I'm just calling it the political approach because I think in this context, the word entitlement is confusing, especially in the context of US politics. But what he's saying is that famines aren't actually about what the crops are doing or what the rain is doing. It's about what our distribution systems are doing. One of the core examples he used to explain this view was the Great Bengal Famine of 1943, in which 3 million people died. The famine was blamed on low rainfall for a while, but Sen studied it and he found that overall food availability was actually unchanged. And more recently, scientists found that rainfall actually increased during the relevant months, and also that there were similar droughts after democratization of India that didn't lead to famine. So a conclusion presenting itself from both Sen's arguments and Mishra and co-authors' arguments is that the cause of the famine was British colonial economic policies. If the year jumped out at you, you might recognize that this was during the Second World War. And so part of the British Empire's concerns was a potential invasion by Japan, which influenced their decision to destroy certain boats that people could have used to fish and otherwise get food in rural Bengal. And that's where the bulk of the deaths by famine happened. Either way, the point is that it's a distribution system failure. It's a political system failure. It's not actually a food availability decline failure. It's not something that happened to the crops. It's not something that happened to the rain. Those things ask the questions, as I put it before, but our fate as people is determined by the answers that our political system presents to these questions. So that's the basic way of understanding climate crisis, environmental crisis that I have, right? I think this is all pretty straightforward. We could have an ecological approach where we think the danger of climate change is based on what the hurricanes will do, what the rain will do, what the wind will do, how much land is arable. All those things matter, of course. but they matter in terms of how they set the stage for our political responses. And it's those responses, I think, that we should, that are rightly the object of our focus. I'm not going to say too much about this just because I imagine I'm in a group of people that well understands what's at stake, but immigration politics is a particular place of importance where our political successes or failures really will drive the question of whether or not the acceleration of climate crisis over the coming decades will be genocidal, or whether it will prove that we have better political systems than we think. So the danger of climate crisis, how our political systems respond to movement in the case of immigration politics, and not the movement itself. So that's just all a long way of saying where I'm coming from, how I think about these issues at their bottom. So what is probably more obviously of interest to a group like this are the more campaign level questions, right? And I think I just want to address the elephant in the room. Again, I don't think that this is a point I need to belabor, because I think folks who are here understand that social change is not linear, understand the process and power of politics, but it's useful to remind ourselves that our decisions matter sometimes more than we think, right? Social scientists who study social change often invoke the story of Martin Luther, who put one Tumblr post on a wall one day, and then suddenly there's a worldwide establishment of Protestant churches, right? That's not some chance thing that happened once in 1 year. That is actually a stable aspect of how systems work, including social systems. There are points at which small changes in one factor can have cascading consequences for the rest of the system, right? So it's not about at every individual moment beating back this climate impact or that bad climate actor. It's about doing enough to spark the kinds of changes that we want. We've already seen this in climate politics, right? Usually I'm loath to evaluate progress in this way, but I do think these numbers are instructive. As recently as 2014, the level of dollars on the planet in assets that investor classes at least stated a commitment to divestment on was about 52 billion. In 2020, this article was published last year, that group had ballooned to over 11 trillion, so orders of magnitude larger, right? Are investors going to save us from climate crisis? Clearly not, but does this mean we can make change faster than we sometimes think? I think so. We have a huge task ahead of us. Part of what we need to change is ecological, part of what we need to change is political, part of it's cultural. And the more we can link these different efforts together, I think the better. So what are the political options? There are top-down approaches, legislation, regulation, financial incentives, bottom-up approaches, pressure campaigns, cultural campaigns for behavior change, veganism, riding your bike to work, those kinds of things. And there are other kinds of campaign sorts of things, and those are the ones I'd like to talk about most. But I want to just bring one thing down from the high-level abstract framework section of the talk to this sort of campaign level. I think how we should think about progress on these issues is in distributive terms. So the burdens right now, the distribution of burdens and benefits of climate crisis that we have in the present moment are perverse. The people who are least responsible and most vulnerable are facing the lion's share of burdens and getting the lamb's share of benefits. And to the extent that we can, change those distributions, we can we can improve things from the perspective of a historically informed kind of racial justice. And I've just been using the term climate reparations, which I very clearly did not invent, which is a thing other people have talked about and mean different things by. I've been using the word climate reparations to explain this perspective. And since other people have used this term and other people mean different things, I'm just telling you what I mean, right? So distributively with respect to these different non-commensurable areas of policy, right? Whether it's mitigation, getting there to be less emissions, whether it's adaptations, making us able to respond directly to ecological impacts, whether it's funding for loss and damage, how we respond when there are severe weather events, for example, how resettlement of people works. Right now a lot of immigration policies end up warehousing people instead of resettling them, and we should return to a resettlement model, I would argue. And carbon removal. Right now, big carbon removal enterprises like the Bond Challenge are, again, heavily concentrated in the global south. In fact, 3/4 of the land dedicated to it is on the African continent alone. And that is a perverse distribution, given that the African continent is responsible for less than 5% of global emissions. They shouldn't be having to face the land use implications of carbon removal projects by their loans, right? So this is making good on the distributive approach I talked about earlier. Justice is about how these things are distributed and whether they're distributed justly. So what are campaigns that make sense? I think one of the things that we need to distribute beyond just resources and money and wealth and burdens is decision-making power. And so bringing more aspects of climate justice under public community level decision-making of a genuine sort, and not just consulting people for advice or making people feel heard, but giving people real meaningful power to decide what's going to happen in their lives. I think we can expect better politics on the other end of that. Participatory budgeting, in particular, is a model for doing this, which was piloted in Porto Alegre by the Workers' Party of Brazil. It's being used in small scale in New York City, but also lots of other places. It's an approach that can enfranchise marginalized community members by involving all residents without necessary regard to citizenship or ability to lobby politicians in meaningful decision-making processes. It's closely related to the idea of citizens' assemblies, or what might also get called sortition is what that should say, not sortation. Blame autocorrect. It's not magic. There are potential drawbacks to approaches like this, but it's something that I think is worth fighting for, and that should be in the toolkit. I'm particularly encouraged by a recent win in Seattle by organizers there, where 30 million of the police budget was retasked to a participatory budgeting program there. I think that's the kind of victory that potentially has legs. Community control over power, or you might also say energy democracy or community ownership of power. Whatever you want to call it, it's another example of potential real community level control over decision making. moving from an sort of investor-owned utilities profit-driven model to one where people are deciding based on more, we would hope, holistic accounts of what's important, accounts of that would make more room, we would think, for considerations of public health and for sustainability. For the same reasons, I think this is something worth considering. And in the quest to win these goals and others, there's an organizing model that I also think is worth considering that is called bargaining for the common good, which some of you might have heard of. It's an approach where organized labor includes community members and organizations, which would include activist organizations, both in figuring out what the contract demands are going to be and in the campaign to win those campaign demands. So the kind of bread and butter issues of wages and working conditions aren't going anywhere. They're just as important today as they've always been. But there's also been a long US labor history of fighting for things beyond those kind of workshop floor level incentives, right? This is what gave us the 8-hour workday. It was recently outlawed for public sector workers in retaliation to a strike by social workers for the living conditions of the people that they were working on behalf of or working to quote unquote serve. But I think that model is a powerful one. The Chicago Teachers Union has recently put it to good work. An SEIU local in Minnesota used it to win green demands in addition to wages and health benefits for their workers in what labor notes called the first climate strike. So it's a model that has been used that could potentially increase the kind of negotiating power and political leverage of marginalized communities. And I'm stressing these kind of community-based models, participatory budgeting, community control over power, bargaining for the common good, because my account of racial capitalism is what it is, right? There's a system that produces and exploits group level differences and vulnerability. And part of the way that it exploits that, an important part of the way it exploits that is it decides whose interests are protected and who's protected. And part of the way that it decides who that is it decides who's at the levers of power, who gets to decide what decisions get made. And when these decisions get made by politicians, even elected ones, when these decisions get made by profit-seeking combinations of private interests, they have reliably worked to the detriment of the most vulnerable and least protected. And putting those people in the driver's seat, I think, is the right kind of political response to that situation. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm looking forward to talking with you all. Those are my cards. They're on the table. Thanks.
Awesome. We'll start kind of taking questions in the chat here. And just kind of following up on some of the concepts you introduced, Femi, I wonder, something that struck out to me was you had mentioned sort of carbon removal, and this has been something you've been writing about a little bit more lately, but you framed it in the way of land being used for carbon drawdown, and how in Africa in particular, you have these huge swaths of kind of like, I guess in the West, we call it something like wilderness or something like that, that are supposed to be put aside and not touched and kind of like left to draw down. Can you just expand a little bit more on why that's unjust, and then maybe even link it into sort of like the history of colonialism and how maybe this isn't that much of a departure from what we've seen in the past?
Yeah. My partner and I have an inside joke that, I can't answer a question without starting in 1492. I'm going to try not to do that, but nevertheless answer the question that you asked. So I think let's start in 2008, right? So there's the global recession, crisis in financial institutions, capital goes flying everywhere, commodity prices go up. And one of the kind of footnotes to this story, which will start being more important, I think, as the century goes on, is there was a global land rush. So there's actually an influx of capital to the acquisition of land in the global south. Asia was hit hard, Latin America was hit hard. No one was hit harder than Africa. And a massive arable land was purchased in this period that represents the size of Zimbabwe, right? Something like a quarter of the available arable land on the continent. That's just to give you a global international capital picture of the backdrop of what I think is centrally at issue with conservation, with certain kinds of carbon removal technologies, especially ones that are particularly land intensive, right? Which is, at the bottom of all of these things is the politics that we've, in the US especially, forgotten about to some extent, which is land use politics. And land use politics is grimy, right? Like people, this isn't stuff where, people enter and leave political coalitions around, or just enter and leave political coalitions around. Like these are the kind of political interests people kill over, right? And what's at stake in land use politics, bears a cosmetic resemblance, of course, to the history of colonialism, right? What we imagine is someone showing up on territory and planting a flag and saying, this belongs to the queen now. But more than just cosmetic, it's literally the same things at stake: control over resources, control over territory, right? And so we have to think about how land use politics and the problems of land use politics are distributed across the earth. A lot of these countries and corporations are starting to make net zero pledges, right? And we have yet to go into the deep underbelly of what all these pledges are and see what the reliance is on offsets, on carbon offsets, and what the story is about what this means. But if I were a betting man, I'd bet the farm that the plan, more often than not, is to tell a bunch of people in the global south, do this with the land and not that, so that we'll pay you a bunch of money for that privilege so that we can greenwash and launder our public relations image and say that we're part of the solution, right? And what that means concretely in the parts of the world where land use is disputed, or even land rights are disputed, is potentially an uptick in exclusion, an uptick in land use that reflects the PR needs of transnational capital rather than local needs for, say, food and grazing, for pastoralists and indigenous rights, and so on and so forth. And there's a whole world of political problems on the other side of land use politics that we're trying to confine and essentially dump in the global south, right? And so what I would like to see is a much greater investment, not just for the dollars for carbon removal to come from the global north, but for the actual siting and implementation and deployment to come in the global north, the geographic distribution of these sorts of things.
Great. And I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about Nigerian politics, and there's a lot of writing and theorizing about kind of the role of like the oil industry coming in there, causing a bunch of problems, the kind of like proletarianization, I guess, of people, and kind of like pushing people off the land, and sort of like a lot of problems that come from like just trade opening up and things becoming commodified. I wonder if you want to comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Nigeria is a situation like other places where there's this sort of, what some people call the resource curse, which I think is downstream of these kind of political distribution arrangements, right? So whether we're talking about, the elites who in every sense are just far away, right? So the owners of Royal Dutch Shell, the chief executives in British Petroleum, right? But even, quote unquote local elites who, trade their knowledge of and stature in the relevant regions where oil can be produced for exorbitant amount of money, a middle manager position in a global kleptocratic economy, a top position in a local kleptocratic economy, and the ability to just fly to London and raise their kids there in isolation from the ramifications of their decisions, right? The story about how and why that happens and to whom is one that is just a variation on a theme from the perspective of racial capitalism and the way it conceptualizes of colonial history in that respect. And very often is companies and or state interests from the very same places that colonized the countries at issue, right? And so there's a story of that kind to tell about the Nigerian case, but not just the Nigerian case, right? So, there's a few things that, end up coming together that aren't necessarily always thought of as kind of pairs or groups or teams. So on the one hand, the kind of global desire and need for, whether it's degrowth or just green energy investment, but a much different decision about, democratization in a deep sense, and not just a kind of cosmetic sense of the presence of elections or this and that, but the actual meaningful ability of people to control the basic constituent parts of their own lives and their communities' lives. And we see that absent in many parts of the global South, but especially when transnational interests of capital get involved.
Yeah, and it seems to fit in what you were saying with earlier around the distributional aspects of a racistly designed economy, where sort of the needs of whatever's going on with the market or whatever's in fashion at any given time are going to dictate where materials come from and go, rather than what people actually need on the ground.
Right.
Great. I'm going to turn to some audience questions here. So Matthew Kennedy is asking, appreciate your application of the just transition framework beyond extractive energy industry to institutions like prisons and the military. Could you elaborate on what just transition could look like as we defund or abolish prisons in the military industrial complex? How would you describe the relationship between just transition and abolition?
So let me start the second part. I think I would describe abolition as an important, it's kind of a part-whole relationship. So I think abolition is something that's part of a just transition. And I think it's very unobvious if you're just, looking at these separate issues. One's about whatever energy and the location of jobs, and the other is about policing, which we don't always necessarily think of in terms of jobs and those sorts of things. But as as the question communicates, there is a connection between those two things. And for me, how I think about that connection is, at bottom, it goes back to what Gilmore was saying, right? A kind of standard fundamental aspect of how our society is organized is what group differences in vulnerability, how they get created, how they get exploited, and how the resulting system now in sense terms responds to crisis. Right now, we have a situation, especially in the United States, but certainly not exclusively in the United States, where the way that interests are protected are by wielding violence towards marginalized people, right? So the people at the top, the profit margins of the most successful or largest corporations are the constant beneficiaries of significant action at various levels of society to secure those interests. And policing is part and parcel of that larger kind of, I call it antagonistic security framework, right? We secure these people by making it violence, by making things dangerous, by making things precarious for other people. We make it dangerous for you to organize. We make it dangerous for you to challenge the system, so on and so forth. And, you know, there's some suggestive stuff in even the progression of welfare politics and mass incarceration in this country, right? We often talk about the 94 crime bill, but talk less about the 96 welfare reform bill that came as a result of the same kind of coalition of political interests, right? So at bottom, I think the question is, you know, what is it that we're protecting? And if we decide we're protecting people and everyone and not just the people at the top, that means that we need to protect the workers who are currently employed in extractive industries because that was the lane available to them. And we have a just transition for them to something else because we also need to protect the planet. We need to protect the aspects of the environment that people rely upon. And in order to do any of that, we need a politics that isn't premised upon just protecting the people at the top from those very same people who are disproportionately low income people of color, right? Which policing as an institution, which militarism as an approach to politics, and which especially the United States military, which is, I think, fairly extraordinarily interventionist, kind of represents this way of thinking about security and way of making it real in politics. So I think all these things are ultimately of a piece: abolition, just transition. It's about creating a political environment where we genuinely protect everybody and don't kind of cannibalize some to protect others.
Great. There's a question in the chat that's about the role of the US military. You touched on a little bit. Is basically, the question is, can we push more Green New Deal type conversations to adopt more concrete anti-war strategies? Do you think that's viable, advisable?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, for the conceptual reasons that the last question and answer brought up, I certainly think it's viable and important in a kind of conceptual sense. I think the tricky question is how, right? You can imagine a kind of defund type movement of the kind that's been leveled at policing, at the military. I think we would be up against very different levels of backlash if we were to do that, both from, you know, the wider society, having been socialized as it has about US militarism, but also from the kind of elite established institutions who have very much in a bipartisan way drunk the Kool-Aid about the importance of having a military of world conquest proportions. So I do think a kind of anti-war politics is important, but I don't, you know, there are tactical questions to ask about what that looks like. One interesting scenario, which is one it seems to be being advocated by thinkers like Toby Chow and Jake Werner, who think a lot about US-China relations, is about how to redirect some of the political energy that is now going to state competition between those two countries who are, very influential, very geopolitically powerful, and how to redirect that towards, less antagonistic and thus less climate suicidal kind of politics. One of the things they've talked about is a kind of joint global green stimulus or joint global Green New Deal. I forget what language they chose exactly, but something like that to get them to cooperate on something which the world needs, which is more resources towards, sustainable environmental and economic ways forward for the vast majority of humanity. And so that's the kind of thing that is functionally anti-war. It doesn't look like the Vietnam War protests look like, but it may well, there may be tactical reasons why that kind of thing is a good idea.
Great. And sticking on the sort of internationalist theme, Valerie asks, what do you think should be like 5 big demands of a global internationalist Green New Deal? Like, what are the principles we should be on?
Oh, that's a really good question. I would love to see everybody else's answers to this. But I got asked the question, so I guess I should say mine. 5 key demands. So I think one key demand for me, is a global recommitment to resettling. The current practice that we have is already unconscionable of warehousing, of literally warehousing people in a lot of developed countries. And I think the implications of that politics that we already have, plus global moves towards eco-fascism in a number of countries throughout the world, adds up to a genocidal scenario when we're talking about the levels of displacement that climate crisis is going to cause in the medium term, kind of decades down the line, right? And we have to, border militarization, strong violent policing, a border wall, this is the right wing. The right wing already has its answers to these questions, right, of what migration politics is going to be. And I think first and foremost in my mind of demands for a global Green New Deal is, we need different answers than that one. And I think that should be kind of, at the top maybe. There are some wonky things that I have to say about supply chain analysis of justice. I'm not quite sure how to make them into a kind of punchy, cool political demand, except maybe to say the regular, boring old commie thing of like, hey, what's kind of naturally transnational? Organized labor movements who work in supply chains that are in fact transnational and so have concrete reasons to engage in that kind of politics that other people don't have. That seems pretty cool to me. I'm not sure how to condense it into a single demand. And then I guess the other demands for a global Green New Deal would be strong North-South investment, or global North assumption of kind of the default burden in mitigation, loss and damage, and carbon removal.
Then this is kind of like a follow-up to that, but like in terms of organizing something like that, like who do you make these demands to? Like, what do you think are some of the fruitful ways? I mean, and I think back a little bit to the, like global justice movement and how that worked with like the WTO and kind of how that fizzled as soon as like the war on terror kind of came up and drove environmentalists and social justice and labor activists kind of underground a little bit by throwing that terror word around. But I wonder, you know, what kind of confidence do you have in sort of like states right now, or transnational institutions or national institutions for these types of demands? And do you think there's any other kind of like, you know, models of organizing that you really look to and like?
Yeah, I think that the target is different for different issues and different demands, right? A broad sweeping thing I would say across these is there aren't good institutions, and that's by design, right? The multinational institutions and even the institution of the state system itself has been deliberately crafted by colonialism to reproduce the kinds and distributions of power that the colonizers put in place, right? So it's no accident that these institutions function as they do, and it's no accident that we don't have a competing set of institutions that function better, right? But that's the situation we're in that across demands. How's it function differently in different demands? If we're talking about migration justice, I just don't see, you know, like it or not, what having the history of state sovereignty means is that the places where action happens on those kinds of questions are at the state level, or, you know, in the case of some kinds of confederations of states like the EU, maybe a kind of supranational level. But that's about it. Like, you know, the African Union is not where this kind of thing gets decided, to my knowledge, right? You know, the Organization of American States is not where this kind of thing gets settled, to my knowledge, again, right? It gets settled by the US and then whatever back channels it has with other states. It gets settled by South Africa, whatever back channels it has with other states, et cetera, et cetera. So migration means you have to do state politics of one kind or other. Is that true for, say, mitigation, right? So you can imagine a kind of ragtag grassroots movement that said, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to push these people to divest. We're going to put a bunch of bubble gum in those pipelines, and we're going to, you know, we're going to just grassroots this out. And the end result of doing that at a massive scale, or doing that in a bunch of places and inspiring other people to do the like thing, is going to be less emissions, because it's going to force other people, you know, who might be in state power or might be at the World Bank or whatever, to start taking seriously this other stuff that's on the table, renewable energy, so on and so forth, right? So you can tell a different story about the intended actor on mitigation than you can on migration. But these are all, you know, what's consistent across these is you have to kind of improvise, and you have to respond to what's tactically available. And I think, you know, I just want to steer it away from, you know, the moral principles about what's a good institution, what's a bad institution. They all fucking suck. We're stuck with them. We have to just figure out, you know, how we can make them dance and how we can't.
Yeah, it's been interesting to see some of the early stuff come out of the Biden administration. I think we're going to talk about it a little bit next week too, but you know, some like decent signaling around fossil fuel infrastructure projects, some like reviews of Trump era stuff that's going on. And what really seems to be moving quickly is like a reorganization of the financial sector, which is really I was not expecting really, but like pushing kind of back, and maybe even like the US as a state starting to really like divest from fossil fuels. You know, President Biden calling into question like subsidies for fossil fuels. And I wonder, you touched on a little bit as we were leading in, but what's your intuition around this when you kind of see major financial institutions, big players talking in those terms?
Talking in terms of,
we're going to stimulate a green economy, sort of like not necessarily, they don't use the term Green New Deal. I think that's like a toxic term, but just more sort of like, we're going to mobilize resources toward like a different set of investment opportunities that they're sort of like loosely calling green.
Right. Yeah. It's adorable. But you know, at the end, they're going to do what they're going to do, right? You know, in every period of social change towards justice, you know, there's always some version of the, you know, Wendy's stands in solidarity with the Haitian Revolution kind of motherfuckers, right? Like it's just, it's not informative, right? It doesn't mean, you know, I think a lot of people try to either hyper underreact or hyper overreact, right? Where it's just like, oh, well, you know, corporations are in favor of green energy now, so that means green energy must be bad. Just, it's like, no, they've made their calculation. They think their PR is going to do better if they say, if they invoke the color green to describe whatever nonsense they're doing. And we have to make ours, right? And they're going to shift with the political winds. You know, we have to as well, right? So yeah, I think yeah, we want to be wary of trying to read our strategy off the advertising moves that they're doing. They're just playing a much different game than we're trying to play. We're thinking substantively about how we want the world to change. They've long since decided, you know, 10 fiscal quarters ago, they've decided what they've, you know, the actual people that are in charge decided what they were going to do, and they just fed it through a fax machine, or probably not anymore. I'm showing my age, I guess. They emailed it to whoever's in PR and told them to put a bow on it, right? It's just uninformative about our political atmosphere.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, less in terms of like the branding side of things, but in terms of sort of that, I'm thinking about like big kind of economic dynamics in that. I personally don't think that, you know, the finance industry would be like pivoting unless they had some idea that they would get a big return on investment for pivoting. And like, I guess my question is sort of like, where is that return going to come? Like, where is this like frontier that's going to be the new source of like profits coming into the system in order to drive this?
That's a really, like, that is the question. That is a really good question that I really wish I had the answer, right? Because, you know, in a way, it's hard to understand why it took so long, right? Scientifically, you know, much earlier than 2014, the writing was on the wall about what long-term trends in economic progression and social progression were going to have to be, right? And we're not even talking necessarily about like investing in fossil fuel companies. I even mean just insurance premiums, taking into account the, you know, the sea level rise predictions that were available in the 90s. Like the finance types weren't even doing that, right? And I don't, I don't know what accounts for their recent shift. You know, maybe it really is just social signaling, and maybe they're finally kind of, you know, maybe they just finally are getting some sense and are ceasing doing the ignoring of science that they were doing against their own interests up until now. Or maybe like you're saying, maybe there's something maybe a little more nefarious. Maybe it's not something, it's not that we knew all along, something that they're just learning. Maybe they just learned something that we don't know yet about what the economy is going to be. And I really wish I knew which one of those is the case, but I don't.
Yeah, me neither. I'm just sort of stumbling and kind of being like, oh, okay, there's some big pivoting happening here, and trying to sort it out. Maybe some folks in the chat who work in finance and economics might want to noodle on that one for us a little bit. Let's go back to some questions here. Toli asks, what are your favorite examples of past or existing public ownership and participatory governance models in the US or globally? Do you think these are things that we can learn from as we propose and deploy Green New Deal programs in sectors like energy, industry, and agriculture?
Yeah, so I mean, for me politically, I get inspired by the pretty long and storied history of Black cooperative communities, particularly in the Reconstruction South, just as a kind of a touchstone for the kind of political ethos that we're talking about. But I think as the question kind of shows, you know, it's not just what do we find inspiring, but, you know, what do we think we could replicate in much different circumstances than the ones that they were facing. And, you know, I hear some of the energy democracy people talking, not in, you know, entirely rose-colored glasses type ways about previous kind of publicly owned utilities. But, you know, there just is a kind of, you know, the Tennessee Valley Authority happened, right? It was federally owned. It it was a basis for economic development, you know, on the kind of economic development that the federal government recognizes, but that's not nothing, right? There were jobs on the other side of that. There was energy on the other side of that. And, you know, that's a model. It's a model we could and should improve upon. But, you know, it's at least a proof of concept at the level of scale, right? We can have these kinds of approaches under public control. Maybe that's not the model. Maybe that's not the particular kind of public control that we want. But you know, it's not a foregone conclusion that, you know, investors have to own the means of energy production. And hopefully in the world we build, they won't.
There's a question in the chat about a little bit more on sort of like carbon dioxide removal. So specifically the use of direct air capture and other negative emissions technologies as opposed to land-based carbon dioxide removal. This is from Danny. I like your response to critics of DAC and CCS that, to paraphrase, an African case for carbon removal, just because fossil fuel companies are their biggest proponents now doesn't mean we couldn't use these technologies towards systemic change. But what kind of political economy or institutions would you envision that would avoid what's happened in, for example, Australia, where conservative governments have directed billions to CCS research that has produced zero results in terms of captured emissions?
Yeah, it's a really good question, right? So yeah, I think the kind of the good version of this worry is that kind, right? Where there are, in that case, a state government. There are corporate cases where they swear up and down that they'll do CDR of one kind or other and use that promise to continue to convert to entice investors, right? Or to get shareholders to hold their positions, right? And, you know, that danger is kind of inherent to climate politics, but just politics in general, right? The thing I resist is the reasoning that, you know, because fossil fuel companies are for it, that we should be against it, right? You know, like I keep coming back to the Haitian Revolution because it's just a good example, but, you know, like at certain points, the British Empire, and actually even the French Empire, was for the Haitian Revolution, right? And imagine saying to a Haitian person, it's like, well, I don't know about this abolition thing, you know, the British Empire is for it, and, you know, that shows that it must be a trick. It's like, well, you know, they've got their reasons, we've got ours, right? There's not much more to say at that level, but these political kind of considerations at a more granular, concrete level are genuinely worrisome. In particular, I think land intensive, I prefer to think of carbon removal in terms of land intensive versus not land intensive, because that to me, that tracks the kind of politics that I'm worried about, which I said earlier is land use politics, right? The natural versus not natural, I don't have any real investment in. Afforestation is natural, but it takes up a lot of land, and so empowers elites who are landowners to have a lot of say over what happens and what doesn't, and drives the kinds of incentives that drive up food prices and thus make famines exceedingly more likely, right? I'm more concerned with that than the fossil fuel companies winning a PR victory, or the state of Australia winning a PR victory. But all of that said, I think the kind of politics that is required to confront these kind of things has to measure in gigatons, not dollars, right? So Australia's commitment of seriousness is how much money they've put into research, and whatever that research is, who knows? Maybe it'll pay dividends down later. But what we should be holding global north countries to is to gigatons of removal. We shouldn't be holding them to promises about what they might, could, should remove, what they'll consider removing, what they will have other people remove. They should remove it, right? And I think if they're put on the hook for removing things and not for trying to remove things or thinking about removing things, I think the research that they fund will get a lot more serious real quick.
Yeah, so maybe it's interesting now that the US is like theoretically back in the international climate accords and everything to start to head back and start thinking about how we like add some binding commitments to those types of negotiations.
Yeah.
Have you followed at all stuff going on in the EU about their sort of reorganization toward what looks like kind of like a Green New Deal, like big sums of money getting pumped into the economy supposedly for like green development? Is this something that's on your radar at all?
Just that's happening. I don't know any of the details.
Okay. We might talk about that a little bit next week too. Sorry, I'm disorganized and going through these questions here now. The question from Declan Owens, who's also pushing a event, a sort of transnat or international event in the chat, says, "What's your view on the very real prospects of mass climate change related migration from the global south and the implications for issues?" We already talked about this a little bit. I don't know if there's much more to be said, if you have anything else that you want to add to that.
Yeah, I can say a bit more. One thing I've been thinking of is there's a legal scholar whose work I was able to use and learn from. Her name is Tendai Achume, and she wrote this piece called Migration as Decolonization. And her argument was essentially that colonialism created a kind of asymmetrical political relationship between the first world and the third world. And as a result of that relationship, there should be something like kind of blanket first world citizenship, or the rights equivalent of that, for people in the third world. And I think, what she's trying to head off at the pass, as it were, is, she's a student not just of history, but of contemporary politics, and is, looking around at all this eco-fascist stuff and border militarization and far right-wing politics. Is like, how can we, in literal legal terms that we that institutions know how to respect, like the term citizenship? How can we start creating the scaffolding for political rights that is going to prevent genocide, right? And so you know, people rightly have critiques of the idea of citizenship or even the idea of borders, but you know, they're here for the present moment, and how do we prevent them from killing people in mass decades from now, right? And yeah, so that's primarily what I think. You know, I like her idea. If other people had other ideas about how to manage that, I'd be equally open to that. But there's just, you know, there's a really, really serious looming problem that's already happening, right? That's already happening that we need to figure out how to prevent from, you know, getting to huge, you know, hugely genocidal proportions.
Yeah, and for folks who are following and planning on participating in the class, on March 3rd, we'll have a full day devoted to climate migration issues as well. And Camila Bustos, who's on our board and at Yale Law School, is gonna talk a lot about that. So I hope this is like a good start to, I mean, I imagine that this is a conversation that will weave through every class because it's so big. Yeah, and I also, you know, one of the things that just kind of domestically this summer and the rest about like defund movement has kind of brought up to me is like a lot of thinking about kind of like power vacuums that are kind of created if either people intentionally sort of retreating from spaces like, for example, US, you know, like invading a country and then leaving, for example, or security in general. And it may not be a question of sort of like voluntarily sort of people moving out, but just not being able to like sustain empires anymore or something like that. Although technologically, who knows? I wonder if you have any thoughts on kind of like this may be even getting way outside of the areas that you think about, but like with retracting kind of the security state, what do we sort of like, how do we replace things? Like, is that just a resource question, or is that like, how do you think about how issues like this with, and I'm thinking specifically, my partner works in refugee work in the Middle East, right? And so a lot on sort of like ISIS level kind of like reactions and filling power gaps and the sort of like ideologies that pop up in there. And so we were doing a lot of legal observing during protests in Portland where things were wild for months on end. And those were some of the questions that we were sort of thinking about.
Yeah, how do we replace the kind of security structures we have, including at borders? Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, how do we rethink about it, right? Like, and there's, I mean, there are some autonomous zones and there's some interesting sort of like examples around the world of like different places sort of like in a space of trying to create that in ways that seem pretty promising. But it seems that we're moving towards some like big transitions, forced or chosen. And yeah, big question, but just kind of want, maybe this will be like the last one that we touch off of. Do you have any general thoughts in that area?
Yeah, I mean, one thing, so let me give you my philosophy answer and then bumble through a concrete answer. So, you know, I described the kind of policing paradigm and the border militarization paradigm as antagonistic security, right? We make ourselves safe by making those other people by making things dangerous for those other people. And there's another way of thinking about security, which is what I call collaborative security. So it's kind of security we get through herd immunity, right? And not the weird let everybody die discourse about herd immunity that started, not that thing, but just, you know, being in a group of people with immunity, right? Being on top of a sewer system that the entire town shares, right? And that prevents flooding of the entire town, right? Arrangements of society where the thing that makes me safe is the thing that makes you safe, right? And that's the thing we should be trying to build, and that's the thing we should be trying to design. How to do that is a tremendously difficult question. There are kind of literal, kind of architectural versions of this question. So the version of this kind of politics that is increasingly a feature of the politics of New Orleans, Louisiana, right? Where they have literal physical structures, levees, seawalls, floodgates, whose job is to provide this kind of protection. But there are institutional versions of this question which are much harder to answer, right? What is it that we do along strips of land that had been previously called borders? What is it that we do in zones where there's conflict, right? I think, I believe in personal self-defense. I believe in community self-defense. I think organizing, I think mutual aid, people imagine like guns and stuff, which isn't wrong, but I think, mutual aid networks count as community self-defense, right? But, I think one of the things we need to do to live in community as a real community is to figure out some of these kinds of questions. And how to do that with the fact that there's also a state is a difficult question to answer, but not an in principle impossible one to answer, right? There are overlapping systems of governance in parts of Colombia, for example. They're pretty well studied, and I think Nicaragua as well. And, there are things about that work, there are things about that don't, but we're not dealing with something that's conceptually impossible. We're just dealing with a hard question, and life's full of those.
I like that as like a ending space. Questions, some of them are hard. We're gonna think about them. Femi, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really nice to have you, and looking forward to see what your thinking brings in the next months and years ahead. Been really interested to just hear your takes on a lot of things. So I hope that folks who are following today got a lot out of this. And next week, we're going to come back and continue on the theme of international questions around international structures and institutions. Some folks at Breach Collective, myself included, my colleague Danny Noonan and Jay Monteverde, who's our board president and works at an organization called Namati in his day job, are going to talk to you a little bit about international governance as some of the challenges here. And so we might poke more at the institutional frameworks and get a little bit deeper into what's not working, what is, and what are people kind of proposing to make sense of all this. And then kind of like looking beyond that, we've got some classes on Thea Rio Francos is going to talk on February 24th about her experience in South America, especially in Ecuador, around resource politics. Camila Bustos is going to talk on March 3rd about climate migration. Mitch Green is going to talk about Green New Deal economics on the 10th. And so we got 4 classes coming up that are like kind of big picture international questions type classes. And I hope folks will join us for those. Would love your feedback either by email or other means. Looks like there was a suggestion early on maybe to like put a Slack together for folks who are following this to network along the way. And I think Sherry is interested in taking that on. So we'll send out information around that. And somebody says Discord in the chat. So we'll figure out one way or another. If there's a willingness and an eagerness for folks to want to network between classes, we can happily put that together. So thanks again, Femi. Hope you're safe and good. And yeah, we'll see y'all soon.